Tonight on Wings, take off with the Discovery Channel in Flying Pancakes. They revolutionized the theory of flight with their ability to take off vertically and move in any direction. During World War II, it was hoped that the Zimmer skimmer would be the weapon to hunt down Japan's deadly kamikazes at sea. And 10 years later, the Avrocar, pure in shape and design, demonstrated the ability to hover across any terrain. Tonight, soar high with the Flying Pancakes on Wings. In the closing years of the Second World War, the conflict in the Pacific had reached a desperate point for the forces of Imperial Japan. Hoping to avoid defeat at any cost, they resorted to the use of the kamikaze. It meant divine wind and referred to a powerful storm that long ago in Japanese history had destroyed an invading fleet. Although the kamikaze pilots of World War II weren't divine, but merely mortal men, for those aboard the U.S. flat tops they hoped to destroy, their attacks were devastating. In their quest to replicate history, the kamikazes failed, but even in defeat, they exacted a deadly and fearsome toll on American forces. In the desperate search to combat this tactic of last resort, Allied war planners were ready to try just about anything. But how could such tenacity and self-sacrifice be countered? If a young Japanese pilot was utterly prepared to lay his life down for a cause and for a prepared place in heaven as his culture taught him, what could possibly deter him from his target? Compounding the problem was the fact that kamikazes would sometimes start their approach from altitude, so that by the time they reached their selected point of impact, they were traveling very fast. Their speed was so great that often the hail of anti-aircraft fire couldn't be unleashed fast enough to down incoming planes. The closer Japan came to ultimate defeat, the greater the ferocity of Japanese attacks of all kinds. But the suicide missions, utilizing young, inexperienced pilots with limited flying skills, became particularly intense. This saved the experienced pilots to carry on more conventional forms of warfare at a time when Japan had lost many of its combat-hardened aircrews. From the time of the very first kamikaze attack, the U.S. Navy searched for an answer. One simple tactical option was to intercept kamikazes as far away from the fleet as possible. And to some extent, American fighters were successful in screening their fleets with fighter cover. The problem for the Americans was in finding aircraft that had enough speed to catch a kamikaze on his final approach, especially when he was in a high-speed dive. Although it was a long time before the Navy put it into service, the chance-bought F-4U Corsair was one of the fastest fighters of the entire Second World War. Difficulties in landing the aircraft due to the poor visibility it provided the pilot forced the Corsair to serve much of its early career from ground bases. But although its landing qualities were questionable, there was no doubt about its speed. Most importantly, it was faster than anything the Japanese had in the air. After the arrival of the F-4U, other improvements were made to the existing inventory, including the addition of the F-4F and the F-6F. Some of these aircraft were deliberately built in a stripped-down form to reduce weight and increase speed. It was hoped that this would give them a better chance to catch the feared and unpredictable suicide planes. All of these aircraft contributed in some way to combating the kamikaze. but none of them could ever still the divine wind entirely. The Navy continued to look for more speed, and at a time when the speediest aircraft were only capable of doing 400 miles an hour, there was, in the Navy Department's view, the need for a machine that could do at least 450. Given that the jet engine was far from ready for combat, the Navy considered another remarkable idea that might bring the propeller-driven aircraft closer to its highest potential. As U.S. losses in the Pacific mounted, the search for increased speed became a desperate one. The idea was the brainchild of Charles Zimmerman, a little-known research scientist for NACA. But the story of the incredible Zimmerman experimental aircraft actually began before the war, at a time when its inventor was experimenting with new shapes and designs for propeller-driven aircraft. This was an electrically powered model of one of his early concepts. It was put through its paces to see how it responded in short takeoff and landing situations, and how the engines were able to support the aircraft in a near hover attitude, all at a time when the helicopter was still on the drawing board. Data from these early tests went a long way to confirming the Zimmerman theory that his unique wing shape would enable a full-sized aircraft to land in a very short space. Moreover, it proved that the enormous propellers, with their steep angle of attack, would provide for a very short takeoff. As it happened, NACA couldn't see an application for this new design and considered it to be rather extreme. So instead, the first prototype model, V-173, was sponsored by the Vought company, who at the time was developing the F-4U Corsair. Vought's interest in the Zimmerman contract was based on the potential speed that such an aircraft, with its two engines and extremely aerodynamic body, might produce. And this interest was heightened by the design's short takeoff and landing characteristics, essential in a successful Navy fighter. With Boone T. Guyton at the controls, the V-173 was slowly put to the test. Several runs were carried out, during which Guyton familiarized himself with the model's unusual control surfaces. And when the aircraft actually rose into the air for a few brief moments, both pilot and designer felt the time was right to put Zimmerman's theory into practice. The strange craft flew for just 13 minutes, but that was enough time for Guyton to reach some startling conclusions and see that Zimmerman's design lived up to all of its expectations. Its takeoff was short, and the potential for remarkable speed and excellent handling characteristics compared favorably to any other twin-engine aircraft of the day. Tests continued on a regular basis, and the enormous propellers delivered on their promise of short takeoff and excellent slow-speed characteristics. This, together with the plane's superb short landing capabilities, proved that Zimmerman was on the right track. We will return with Wings in a moment on the Discovery Channel.
We're almost at 10 million.
9,999,000. This place is going to go wild.
We're just about ready to hit our 10 millionth friends and family member.
Yes! Yes! Unbelievable. You're witnessing history. You know that, Mr. Wallace? We just hit 10 million customers. That's great.
10 million friends and family customers in less than 2 years. Today we celebrate. Tomorrow, some of the most extraordinary benefits in the history of MCI.
Only one minivan's ever been named an Automobile Magazine All-Star 5 years in a row. Dodge Caravan. And Caravan's a 93 Motor Trend Best Buy. So, we're throwing an award celebration sale. Now own this Caravan with a family value package and get features like air, automatic transmission, and a lot more for as low as $199 per month. So come celebrate with us. Drive a Caravan at your nearest Dodge dealer today.
If you're paying annual fees on your IRA, if you buy mutual funds and pay loads or fees, we have an investment breakthrough for you. Now only Schwab gives you the lifetime guaranteed no annual fee IRA and no-load mutual funds from leading fund companies. Only Schwab gives you the single best way to buy mutual funds for your retirement. So if you're still paying transaction fees or loads,
Maybe it's time to come to Schwab.
Bible says that they shall take up serpents.
Beyond Bizarre, Signatures of the Soul, Sunday, beginning at 9 Eastern and Pacific, only on Discovery Sunday.
The BBC, Turner Broadcasting, and Time Life Video dare you to take a walk on the wild side with Trials of Life. The gripping, award-winning nature video series that exposes the struggle to survive through uncensored, shocking photography. Join acclaimed naturalist David Attenborough for a close encounter with raw nature. See the thrill of the hunt and the strategy of the kill, the relentless drive to continue the bloodline, and the miracle of birth. Call now and receive Hunting and Escaping for $9.99 and see why the law of the jungle is kill or be killed. If it captures your interest, you can get other videos about every other month. Each tape explores the harsh realities of survival in the animal world. Take a walk on the wild side with Trials of Life. Call now to order Hunting and Escaping and find out why we call them animals.
To order your Trials of Life, call 1-800-258-2700 or send $9.99 plus $3.23 shipping and handling to the address shown on your screen.
Now, back to Wings on the Discovery Channel. After the initial success of Charles Zimmerman's V-173 experimental plane, expectations were running hot. Test pilot Boone Guyton's reaction to the aircraft's flying manners was more than enthusiastic, and Zimmerman's theory of short takeoff and landing was proven. The design's potential for high speed was readily apparent. But what about the low-speed end of the performance scale? The electric model had actually hovered, maintaining its position in the air relative to the ground. But would the full-sized V-173 do the same thing? As Guyton eased back on the throttle, military planners were quick to ponder the uses of this remarkable characteristic in a fighting machine. But one of the most curious things about the V-173, or Zimmer's skimmer as it became known, was that years earlier had first postulated his theory. The only encouragement he encountered was unofficial. He was offered assistance from other staff members, but only on a voluntary basis. And the project would have languished but for the fact that his colleagues worked on unpaid after the normal business day. This arrangement went forward only because the Zimmerman concept showed some potential for light, privately owned aircraft operating from small grass airstrips. These were aircraft that could benefit from the short takeoff and landing qualities of the Zimmerman configuration. The idea of a Navy fighting machine that could work from aircraft carriers, fly at high speed with great agility, and if necessary, even hover motionless, was far from the minds of the pre-war NACA staff. But as the clouds of war gathered over Europe, and with Vought sponsorship, the Navy suddenly became very interested in Zimmerman's theory. Other forces were also to play a part in the V-173 project. Charles Lindbergh soon arrived at the Connecticut plant and spent several days closely examining the new aircraft. Zimmerman himself recalled being present not long after these inspections. He stood with Lindbergh and watched Boone Guyton take off on a routine test flight. To their astonishment, no sooner had the aircraft become airborne than it dropped out of sight behind a row of trees, heading toward the sea. Both men climbed into a car and sped in the direction of what they were sure was an accident. When they arrived, they saw the aircraft on the beach, lying on its back, but the pilot was unscathed. He told a remarkable story of how he'd intended to land his plane on the beach, but during the final approach, saw a sunbather lying in front of him. In panic, he hit the brakes so hard that the aircraft flipped over. But the whole event actually encouraged Lindbergh, who said that now that he'd seen how rugged the plane was, he was prepared to fly it himself, and he did so on more than one occasion. Eventually, Lindbergh became just as enthusiastic about the 173's virtues as Boone Guyton and Zimmerman were. With this added political support and the 173's proven record, it wasn't surprising that in July 1944, the U.S. Navy ordered 2 fully powered prototypes. The war in the Pacific was heating up, and the more powerful Zimmer skimmer was seen as the plane with the potential to provide that extra 50 miles an hour that the Navy was looking for. But the 173, although showing potential for high speed, had been restricted by engines that grossly underpowered it. So orders were placed for a new model with 2 1,350-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines, which would be buried in the fuselage near the cockpit. The new model, although similar in size and appearance to the V-173, was constructed out of metallite, a material produced by sandwiching balsa wood between aluminum strips. But as work on the 2 new planes commenced, the 173 was placed under ever-increasing pressure to provide test data and reassurance to military planners. Would the hover characteristics be lost due to the design's more powerful engines and heavier fuselage? Would the new aircraft retain its maneuverability? What about vibration with all that extra power? Some of these questions were answered by flight testing, and some were resolved on the drawing board, but many were never satisfactorily resolved at all. Following the F-4U production fighter was given the title F-5U, F standing for fighter, and U being Chance Vaught's identification letter allocated by the Navy. The middle numeral was the number of successful aircraft to be put into at least prototype production by the company on the Navy's behalf. The Corsair had been the 4th. Zimmerman's design was to be the 5th. But all along there were concerns about the propellers. Even on the V-173, they were a massive arrangement and had a flapping characteristic that the company hoped to avoid on the new aircraft. With the extra kick of the 1,350 horsepower engines, it was thought that 4-bladed propellers, as opposed to the original 3-bladed arrangement, should be employed. But utilizing all this power created problems. In fact, full power was needed just to get the F-5U into the air. So the new model skimmer, when it came off the production line, featured a 2-speed gearbox and actually had a clutch arrangement like a car, enabling the gears to be changed in flight. As if this wasn't complicated enough, it was also deemed necessary to have a complex gearbox between the 2 power plants to ensure that the propellers were synchronized. This involved adjusting and balancing the power from the 2 engines before it was transferred to the propellers. It was a complex and heavy arrangement that moved away from the original Zimmerman concept. And even though the war in the Pacific was now drawing to a close, the potential of the Zimmer skimmer pushed the project along. By August 1945, the first of the 2 prototype F-5Us was ready, except for the propellers. The original manufacturers had not been able to come up with a design that could handle the combination of engine power and the enormous span of the propeller blades. It was only when Zimmerman himself tackled the problem by resorting to the original flapping arrangement used in the first prototype that the plane was finally made ready for takeoff. By now, it was 1947, and 2 incredible years of aviation evolution had gone by. Years that ushered in the jet age, leaving the idea of a piston-engine aircraft with enormous propellers far behind. Certainly, the short takeoff and landing characteristics would still be impressive for carrier use. But jet aircraft were already flying 150 miles per hour faster than the 450 expected from the F-5U. And the F-5U wasn't even in the air yet. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1948 that the F-5U, with its new propellers, was even ready to run up and down the runway. It was a sleek and impressive airplane, but this, the final Zimmer skimmer, was never destined to fly. At a cost of over $9 million, the project had run out of steam. In a jet era, the plane simply had no future. Even so, it is difficult to comprehend why the aircraft was never test-flown. Charles Zimmerman's theory was never fully proven, and the effectiveness of the F-5U will never really be known. The Navy withdrew its funds for the test program on the basis that it couldn't be of any constructive use. Had those tests gone ahead, they would have been done at Edwards Air Force Base in California. But because of the F-5U's unusual shape, road transport was out of the question. Instead, the aircraft would have been shipped by boat by way of the Panama Canal. It was finally decided that making all the special arrangements necessary to go through the canal just wasn't worth it. So the Navy ordered that both prototypes be scrapped where they were. But for a plane that never got into the air, the F-5U put up a great fight. As a matter of fact, it took the wrecking crews 3 times longer than the time allocated to take them apart. Eventually, the rugged planes gave in. And Zimmer's skimmer, a brilliant idea from the mid-1930s, was finally put to rest. Wings will return on the Discovery Channel.
This portion of Discovery is sponsored in part by HBO. It could only happen here.
Big George Foreman is getting ready to fight again. Over the years, his 6'4" of pure punching power has racked up 66 KOs. And now, he's ready to meet his next challenger. Beer Kutzer, January 16th, live and only on HBO. It takes a big man to go up against George Foreman.
Oh, big guy. No. I'm so big, sometimes I even scare myself.
Is Big George ready? Just you wait.
You made me love you.
Have you loved your dog today? Give him new Butcher's Choice biscuits from Milk-Bone. A choice of beef, bacon, liver, and chicken in every box, basted with rich, meaty juices.
Gimme, 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 gimme what I cry for. You know you made me.
New Butcher's Choice biscuits from Milk-Bone.
If you and your checking account could use a change of scene, come on over to Wells Fargo Bank. Enjoy longer hours, 5-minute max teller service, 24-hour person-to-person phone service, and a Wells Fargo Stagecoach check that's a change of scene all by itself. Move all your accounts to Wells Fargo today. The change of scene will do you good. Wells Fargo Bank, a better brand of service.
These are the best weeks to buy at Sears. Save $130 on this 18 cubic foot Kenmore refrigerator, now only $599.99. Or get ice and water through the door on this huge 25 cubic foot model, now just $999.99. Save $250. Both are 30% more energy efficient than models made just 3 years ago. And this large capacity Kenmore washer and matching dryer are at their lowest price ever. Save $50 on the pair. But hurry, Sears' best weeks to buy end Saturday.
Now available on home video. Strange Planes, an amazing 6-hour series about the most intriguing, powerful, and unusual aircraft ever. Strange Planes shows you aircraft you've never seen before.
spy planes, biplanes, and top-secret experimental planes. The power-packed B-52, the suicidal midget drone, and incredible vertical takeoff planes. See secret film footage of AWACS and U-2s on dangerous spying missions. Watch test pilots risking their lives, pioneering their way to the edges of modern aviation. If you love airplanes, you'll want to own this history-making series on extraordinary flying machines. Order Strange Planes for your collection today. Strange Planes, a 6-hour series on VHS video cassette, is only $59.95 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-582-2600 with your credit card ready.
Now we continue with Wings on the Discovery Channel. This is the Hiller Flying Platform. In the 1950s, the military was looking for new forms of personal transport, and a series of devices, all with a touch of Buck Rogers about them, were developed. They were intended to take individuals to the battlefront in an entirely new way. The Hiller Flying Platform, together with several other similar concepts, was tested by the Office of Naval Research. The main virtue of the Hiller concept was its simplicity of design and operation, and it worked surprisingly well. The military envisioned observers flying out to the edge of enemy lines, and then popping up from behind trees and over hills to get a brief glimpse of the tactical situation. They would then return to report on enemy activity. It's quite probable this objective could have been achieved, and certainly many similar ideas were tested during the same period, yet none were ever adopted. It would have been a tough assignment, because troops traveling in this manner would present easy targets and would have little or no opportunity to protect themselves. Moreover, the prospect of an engine failure would be something that even the bravest soldier would prefer not to even contemplate. But still, the logistical advantages of being able to skim over battlefields, minefields, rivers, and forests was very tempting to Army planners. Apart from adjusting the relative speed of the machine's two engines, the operator's principal method of control was redistribution of his body weight over various parts of the platform. This caused the vehicle to move in the direction of the greatest load. Hiller's flying platform never quite made it. And in addition to its rejection by the military, it was a disappointment in civilian markets as well. Commercial flying platforms would have probably attracted a lot of interest from the more adventurous members of the general public. But a swarm of civilian flying platforms would doubtlessly have led to accidents, because as easy as the platforms appeared to be to control, they needed the skill and discipline of an expert to operate safely. Even with a soldier firing from the platform, it's interesting to note just how stable it remained against the rifle's recoil. Ironically, it was the Hiller flying platform's high degree of inherent stability that ultimately killed the project. The problem was that the platform had a tendency to right itself. Going forward depended on the machine's continued lean in the direction of flight, but it constantly wanted to straighten up, and this made it almost impossible to maintain a consistent heading. One of the most interesting experimental flying platforms was the remarkable Avrocar. Designed by the Avro Company of Canada, this flying saucer design once carried the hopes of that nation's aviation industry in what was considered by many, including the United States Armed Forces, a major breakthrough in vertical and high-speed flight. In the early 1950s, the Avro company put forward a proposal for an aircraft that could climb vertically and fly at almost the speed of sound. On paper, it seemed possible, but in practice, it would prove much more difficult. The Canadian government was keen to fund the development of such an idea. Not only was it novel, it showed the potential for a true success story. And if Canada's aerospace industry was to survive, new ideas would have to be pursued and chances taken. At the heart of the concept was a large impeller which produced the thrust that kept the flying saucer above the ground. But soon its expected maximum speed was reduced to 300 miles an hour. And its altitude performance turned out to be more similar to that of the Hiller flying platform than anything else. Even so, both the Canadian government and the American Armed Forces continued to see potential in this unique design. A wooden mock-up made to the same specifications as the working prototype was used to confirm that everything fit in the right place before the real construction effort began. It also gave a very good idea of what the finished craft would look like and what difficulties might be encountered in servicing the machine. While work on the mock-up was progressing, a scale model was placed in a small wind tunnel to analyze the aerodynamic characteristics of the Avrocar in hover and in forward flight. At the same time, a 1/5 sized working model was fabricated from metal. This project was designed to test the effectiveness of the Avrocar's complicated guidance mechanism. This system channeled thrust produced inside the Avrocar in a controllable direction. The whole setup utilized a complex system of vanes and shutters which opened and closed, emitting thrust from almost any point on the Avrocar. The main thrust of the Avrocar was directed downward to keep it off the ground. In its final form, it was a heavy vehicle, so a substantial amount of thrust was necessary. The unique way in which this thrust was produced was the secret behind its expected success. In the mid-1950s, the Canadian government guarded the Avrocar's technology very closely and was prepared to go to considerable lengths to make sure confidentiality was preserved. Although the Avro factory employed thousands of people working on many projects, it was only the select few working directly on the Avrocar who knew anything about its existence at all. The design of the Avrocar was extremely complex. Not only did the fuselage have to support the massive impeller, jet engines, and thrust reservoir, but it carried fuel tanks, accommodation for 2 crew members, and freight as well. And this was all done with a circular shape that didn't lend itself to being divided into compartments. But one advantage of the circular shape was that the main structure could be built from 3 identical pieces, using what became known as the pie principle. Once the 3 components of the pie were ready, they were mounted on a jig for precision assembly. It was only then that the jigsaw puzzle of internal parts could be put together. As the craft started to take shape, the limited internal space was filled with all the necessary components to make the Avrocar work. Electronics, hydraulics, pneumatics, fuel lines, and engine controls had to be married together in a complex structure for which there was no precedent. And all the time, the work was kept secret. An elaborate system of security badges ensured that only the right people had access to the project. At the same time, Avro's more public and in some ways more ambitious project, the Arrow, was well underway and employing hundreds of people just a few yards down the corridor. Slowly, the Avrocar's major components came together. But everything was built around a large hole remaining in the center of the craft. This was left to provide a position for the model's most important component, the lightweight, high-speed impeller. The impeller, or turbo rotor as it was called, was the main feature of the Avrocar. But to be efficient, the blades would have to be both light and strong, so a solid material would not do the job. Instead, an elaborate prefabrication was undertaken, making each blade a hollow unit with some internal reinforcement. The structure involved a brazing process which locked all the components together. This made it stronger than if it had been shaped out of one piece of metal, and yet many times lighter. When all the blades had been produced, they were assembled as a turbo rotor. This process required the utmost precision. The turbo rotor would spin at thousands of revolutions per minute, and the slightest deviation would cause the whole structure to explode and disintegrate with almost certainly fatal results. To ensure that the assembly was safe, the first turbo rotor was tested for no less than 150 hours before it was considered ready for installation. But the cost of research and development continued to increase, and by 1955, the Canadian government had lost all interest in the project. It was passed on to the U.S. Department of Defense, and they continued the endeavor in search of what would prove to be a frustrating and elusive goal. Wings will return on the Discovery Channel. 400 feet below the ocean surface, there's no sunlight, no air. Meet the Saturation Divers on the world premiere of Those Who Dare, Thursday at 9:30 Eastern and Pacific, only on the Discovery Channel.
Yeah, my plane was 3 hours late last night.
Late? What about our presentation?
I'm all set.
But we made changes after you left.
Yeah, Jim faxed them to me.
And you made the changes?
On all 20 copies.
At that time of night? Well, how about the charts?
Done.
And the transparencies?
In color, everything's bound and ready.
That's great. But how'd you do it?
Connections.
Connections? What connections?
Kinko's, your branch office 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
What if you were trapped in the most brutal place on Earth without anything to live on?
We've got to eat. You would.
Without anything to hope for?
It's out there in the snow. It's just me and Antonio. Food.
How far would you go to survive?
It's what we gotta face. I won't do it.
In 1972, they overcame the impossible by doing the unthinkable. Alive. Rated R. Starts Friday, January 15th.
How does your Genie screwdriver door opener work?
You got this big screw, see? And it's real long, and the thing just turns like that, so the door slides real quiet.
Any mom with a lot of kids could use a Genie.
Genie screwdriver, built for a lifetime.
2 years ago, Operation Desert Storm hit the Persian Gulf. Now see exclusive footage of air missions, the aircraft, and the pilots who flew them. Don't miss Wings Over the Gulf, Friday at 10 Eastern and Pacific, only on the Discovery Channel.
There's only one place to see Barbra Streisand bring a masterpiece to life.
Why would she do that? What are you all hiding?
To see Nick Nolte give the performance of his career.
I don't like being lied to. I don't like secrets.
To see the film nominated for 7 Academy Awards. Barbra Streisand, Nick Nolte, the Prince of Tides.
The Old West, a time of Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Smith & Wesson, a land isn't big enough for Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West show, where hardship and misfortune met romance, and myth often blurred reality. Somewhere between the Kansas border and Virginia City, there exists the real West. Join host Kenny Rogers and a cast of real American outlaws and heroes when they go in search of the real West. Thursday on A&E.
Now we continue with Wings on the Discovery Channel. Unique to its time, America's attempt in the 1950s to build the flying saucer known as the Avrocar went forward. Eventually, the thrust impeller was married to the main frame of the aircraft. Powered by 3 Continental engines, the impeller was not driven by shafts in the conventional way. Instead, its tips were subjected to thrust from the jet engines, and its power was the result of this pressure, keeping the impellers turning at a steady speed. Other thrust from the jet engines could be drawn off and channeled to the various vanes around the saucer's circular design and used to control the Avrocar's direction once it was off the ground. Pitch, yaw, and forward and aft control were adjusted by opening or closing various ducts. At best, this was a complicated process, and at worst, it may have been an unachievable goal. But still, defense funds kept coming in, because if the concept worked, it could have opened up tremendous possibilities. The instruments, controls, and even the twin cockpits were now fitted into the structure. But before anything else could happen, the Avrocar in its completed form had to be weighed. Engineers had to be certain how much weight the 3 Continental jet engines would be dealing with. Finally, it was rolled out of the test area and onto the runway. Only now could it be tested as a complete, but at this stage, unmanned aircraft. By this time, the American Army was more interested in the Avrocar as a sort of flying jeep, an aircraft that could skim over difficult terrain and perhaps be armed with recoilless anti-tank rifles or a small cannon, while the U.S. Air Force still retained considerable interest in the Avrocar's unique propulsion system. If nothing else, the Avrocar was a thoroughly tested air vehicle. In fact, it was in various stages of testing and development for an incredible period of nearly 6 years. After that, one of the 2 completed aircraft was packaged and sent to the Ames test facility in the U.S. Because of its 18-foot width, wind tunnel testing had to take place outside of Canada in the U.S. But at this stage of the Avrocar's development, data generated in the wind tunnel was not of the utmost concern. The real acid test was the maiden flight of Avro's Model 1 Avrocar on December 5, 1959. With so much money and time invested, the results of the first flight were eagerly and nervously awaited by both the civilian and military members of the team. Throughout all of this, a dense blanket of security had been maintained. Few people even knew about the Avrocar except for the occasional vague mention in the press of a vertical takeoff aircraft. It certainly looked impressive, and came at a time when there had been many reports of aliens and flying saucers in the U.S. and Canada. But for the designers, one question remained: would it fly? Wings will return on the Discovery Channel.
This portion of Discovery is sponsored in part by HBO. It could only happen here.
Big George Foreman is getting ready to fight again. Over the years, his 6 foot 4 inches of pure punching power has racked up 66 KOs. And now, he's ready to meet his next challenger. Beer Kutzer, January 16th, live and only on HBO. It takes a big man to go up against George Foreman.
Oh, big guy. No. I'm so big, sometimes I even scare myself.
Is Big George ready? Just you wait.
As a truck company for 90 years, we understand the value of a strong frame. A reassuring strength for towing, whether you're on road or off road. GMC Truck, the strength of experience.
Do you know what you need to know about managing your money? Take the Wall Street Journal Personal Finance Test and find out. Are you wasting money by buying a car rather than leasing it? Are there drawbacks to refinancing a loan at a lower rate? When can you throw away old tax returns? You'll find the answers in this free book, The Wall Street Journal Guide to Understanding Personal Finance. The guide is filled with information, from financing your new car to refinancing your home. There's even information on how to lower your taxes. It's yours free when you subscribe to The Wall Street Journal. Every business day, The Wall Street Journal gives you the news, analysis, and insights you need to make the right decisions for your business, your career, your future. Subscribe now to The Wall Street Journal. Get 13 weeks of the journal for $37, over 20% off the newsstand price, and your free copy of the Guide to Personal Finance. Call 800-523-9800. That's 800-523-9800.
January 17th, 1991. Operation Desert Storm hits the Persian Gulf, and a month-long air attack paves the way for ground forces. Now see exclusive footage of the high-risk air missions. See the aircraft up close. Meet the pilots in control. Don't miss Wings Over the Gulf, Friday at 10 Eastern and Pacific, only on the Discovery Channel. Now we return to Wings on the Discovery Channel. The Avrocar's maiden flight took place on December 5th, 1959. The vehicle demonstrated that it could rise under its own power, lifting its heavy body purely on the downward thrust of the large centrally mounted turbine. The Avrocar's unique control system that kept the aircraft stable and allowed the pilot to control the machine's course seemed to function with some degree of effectiveness. But it became readily apparent that this aircraft was never going to reach the expected 300-mile-an-hour cruising speed. And the 700 once predicted was now only a fantastic memory. More importantly, it was clear that the Avrocar would only be able to rise a few feet off the ground, primarily because so much of the thrust created in the central core was dissipated once it left the impeller. And yet it did appear to be a useful vehicle, possibly as a military scout or reconnaissance unit, or perhaps to replace the Jeep. After that first flight, it was put through its paces to see just what limitations existed and what possibilities there may have been for further development. In light of the fact that the U.S. ended up paying the bulk of development costs, it's not surprising that close attention was given to these early tests. But on those first flights, the test pilot's principal problem was coming to terms with an aircraft that had extremely unusual control surfaces. In fact, it was unlike any other aircraft except the helicopter. It could hover, go sideways, or even backwards. One of the Avrocar's major limitations was its inability to gain altitude. It demonstrated that it could handle a variety of terrain conditions, including mud, swamps, and gravel, very well. And it could even travel over large rocks and other solid objects. But as this test film showed, it could only get over a 7-foot fence if part of the fence was lowered. Limitations like these caused U.S. enthusiasm to wane. And considering that so much money had already been spent on the project, it seemed unlikely that any better results would be achieved with continued funding. By now, even the veil of secrecy Avro had managed to maintain was considered no longer necessary. And for a while, Avro staff members who worked on other projects became used to seeing the Avrocar as it was put through a variety of tests on grounds surrounding the airstrip. Quite early in the test program, American pilots learned to fly Avro's flying saucer. And there seemed to be general agreement that although the model in no way achieved the parameters first envisioned, it still might have some use as a pure research vehicle. It was thought that it could become a tool from which other projects might be developed. The Avrocar's principal flaw was that all the power and energy generated by its sophisticated turbine and the 3 Continental jet engines was in large part wasted as it hit the ground. The thrust was enough to keep the aircraft in the air, but only at a great expense to energy and fuel. And beyond that, the model's fuselage really wasn't practical. It might have been aerodynamically feasible at 300 miles an hour, but those speeds were never realized. And as far as the usefulness of the remaining space was concerned, it could just barely fit 2 pilots and a limited amount of payload. In reality, the Avrocar looked a lot better than it performed. Its perfectly symmetrical shape and space-age lines inspired dreams of some super form of transport of the future. But in the present, its performance was a huge disappointment to those who poured so much into its creation and development. And yet, with all the criticism, Avro, in effect, had come close to success. They hadn't built a space-age flying machine, but they'd almost come up with something else, an effective all-terrain vehicle. The Avro engineers had gotten everything right except for one detail. That missing link was the simplest, most inert and unsophisticated component imaginable. In coming back to Earth from its original ambitions of altitude and speed, all that was needed to make the Avrocar a viable all-terrain vehicle was about 50 feet of common rubber matting, because what Avro had designed was, in effect, a hovercraft or air cushion vehicle without the skirt. It was left for the British SRN-1 to take a similar but much less sophisticated design, equip it with a mundane rubber skirt, and go on to produce a vehicle that, from its introduction in the early 1960s, completely revolutionized travel over difficult terrain. Thus, in its own way, the Avrocar, with its unique circular shape, greatly contributed to the evolution of flight. It was an important stepping stone to progress, and the 2 vehicles still survive to this day in museums in the U.S., but negotiations are underway to have one returned to its native soil in Canada, for it represents a brave attempt by a small nation to achieve and innovate and dream. Some criticize the Avrocar project as foolhardy, but that's a term that was even applied to pioneers like the Wright brothers. In fact, few of the major successes in aviation appeared to be sensible or even feasible in their embryonic stages. All invention requires risk, and all risk requires courage. The Avrocar was a brave but valuable failure.
Join us later tonight as we explore the unsung beauty of the Canadian prairies on Discovery Prestige. But first, scientists attempt to unlock the mysteries of England's crop circle on Beyond 2000. Next.
This portion of Discovery is sponsored by Kinko's. Call 1-800-743-COPY.